In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Y'all know this one, right? Now the earth was chaos and emptiness, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. And then, on day one, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness night. Everybody knows day one. What about day two? If we modern folk were outlining this story, we'd most likely put the sun up next. It's the center of everything we know, the source of light and energy and gravity and life itself. And so what Genesis puts on day one seems strange to us. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And so it was. God called the dome sky. And there was evening and there was morning, the second day. There you go, Torontonians and Blue Jay fans. It is and always has been the Sky Dome, not the Rogers Center. God said it, that settles it. For the rest of us, the more pertinent question is, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters on day two? Other translations call it a vault, an expanse, a firmament dividing the waters from the waters. Wikipedia helpfully illustrates this ancient biblical understanding of the cosmos. There's a lot going on there, but for today, I'll point out the firmament or dome that encases the sky. As these ancient Semites saw it, the upper limits of the sky were solid, a sort of crystal wall holding back the water above it, the upper seas, with windows of heaven that let some of the moisture through from time to time. Likewise, underneath the earth is also water, the great deep. And that's why we sometimes see water flowing out of the ground, springs and geysers, the fountains of the deep. Holes above and holes below, allowing just enough water to come forth to irrigate the land. And sometimes too much water comes through. That's what happens in Genesis chapter 7, the story of Noah and the great flood. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened, and rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Water from above, water from below. Inescapable, essential, yet terrifying. I know from a modern scientific perspective, there's a lot wrong with that picture. But on the other hand, the sentiment of this image is pretty accurate still. We are all tiny mortals on a rocky planet, hurtling through space with only a razor-thin slice of atmosphere protecting us from asteroids and radiation and the utterly terrifying nothingness of space. Our understanding of the structure of the universe is different, but if we're honest, the existential dread is the same. And so, as they saw it, the role of God in the world was separating the waters, actively holding back their chaos and destruction with the sky dome. The symbolism of God holding back the waters runs deep throughout the Hebrew Bible. The great flood, dividing the Red Sea in the Exodus story, holding back the Jordan River to let Israel cross into the land of promise. The showdowns between Yahweh and Baal, the storm lord. The poetic imagery of storms and floods and ocean depths in the Psalms and prophets. The waters were chaos and destruction, and God was safety and security from the storm. That ancient tradition is the context of the story of the storm on the Sea of Galilee that we read from Mark chapter 4. When Jesus calms the storm, when the waters go quiet at the sound of his voice, Jesus is doing what God does in those ancient stories. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? This is no ordinary teacher, not even a prophet. Jesus is doing what only Yahweh does. And in the middle of the story, when the disciples cry out for help, that's a call that likewise echoes back all the way to the beginning, to the Exodus slaves in Egypt, to Noah and the great flood. Lord, don't you care if we're being destroyed? That's the ancient cry of the people of God. And what sets Yahweh apart from all the other powers in the old stories is that Yahweh is the God who hears, who answers that cry for help. God's people call out, and God responds with strength to rescue them from the storm. The salvation story. But this one in Mark's gospel ends differently. As I described last week, the gospel stories work on multiple levels. Remember that this gospel of Mark was first written to the Christ followers in Rome. These Messianic Jews were in the middle of their own storm in the first century. They were scapegoated for the burning of Rome. They were hunted and killed for their identity as followers of Jesus. They were being destroyed in real time, and they were crying out for help. But for them, God hasn't been showing up to hold back the waters. There hasn't been a last-minute rescue, not so far. They were dying. Lord, don't you care if we are being destroyed? A fair question. Where was God for the Christians in Rome? Their leaders, their loved ones, their neighbors, how many had to die? How much did they have to suffer? How desperate did things have to get before God would respond? Don't you care if we're being destroyed? I can feel Mark writing this story directly for them. And at first glance, this seems to be exactly what they want to hear. On the Sea of Galilee, Jesus woke up at the cries of his disciples. He responded to their fears by doing what Yahweh does, calming the storm, rescuing them from the chaos, bringing peace. But then, Jesus said to the disciples, "Why were you so frightened? Have you no faith?" Well, that's unexpected. A little snarky for what we're used to seeing from Jesus. Where's the compassion, the comfort? The disciples didn't seem to do anything wrong. The storm wasn't their fault. Jesus sent them off into it. And when they were overwhelmed, they called out for help. Isn't that what God's people have always done? We get in trouble and we ask God to rescue us, and God responds with salvation. The disciples played that role perfectly. So, what was Jesus upset about? Why was he challenging their faith and calling out their character? Good questions. Keep reading. I've been using Alexander Shaya's book, Heart and Mind, as the main source for this series. Shaya points out that this storm story is part of a larger pattern in Mark's gospel. There are no less than 4 crossing the sea stories in this middle section of Mark. Jesus is moving around the region as a nomadic teacher, and he keeps going back and forth across the sea, which makes sense. Jesus' mission is sponsored by a bunch of fishermen. He has access to boats, and the sea routes made for efficient travel to spread the word far and wide. But the Sea of Galilee was also dangerous. Furious storms came up with little warning all the time. To attempt a crossing was risky at the best of times, and to go at night was asking for trouble. There was a reason that the people of the region associated waters with chaos. The sea was deadly serious. And yet, Jesus kept sending his disciples out there, twice in the very middle of the night. And when they resisted, he grew increasingly impatient with them. Here's the rundown. At the first crossing, as we read, Jesus did calm the storm when the disciples begged for his help. But he wasn't pleased with them. Why were you so frightened? Where is your trust? He saved them, but apparently he expected something more from them. Next came the encounter with the wild man called Legion. As you may recall, Jesus dramatically cast a whole host of demons out of this man and sent them into a herd of pigs. an awesome story for another time. As a result of Jesus' intervention, this man was made sane and whole. But the community hated him. They were already afraid of the guy. They had kept him chained up in the middle of a cemetery. And now, through some witchcraft, he and Jesus had destroyed all of their pigs. A mob formed and chased Jesus back to his boat, demanding that he leave immediately. And as the disciples were getting ready to shove off, the man formerly called Legion came running up. "Please, let me go with you." In spite of and because of the miracle, he was in trouble. There was no place for him among his people anymore. He was asking Jesus to save him. But this time, Jesus rejected him. He sent him away. "Go back to your people and tell them what God has done for you. You don't need me. Your place is here. You have everything you need already." So much for the open table. Come and follow. Jesus crossed the sea and left this guy there, alone, and facing a different kind of storm, told to fend for himself. In the third crossing, Jesus does the same thing to his disciples. That day had been a long one, the famous feeding of the 5,000. The disciples had worked hard passing out food. They'd been through a lot already, but Mark says that Jesus forced them to get into the boat and go on ahead without him, to make the dangerous crossing at night on their own. Jesus needed some alone time, apparently. But as he prayed, he saw that out on the lake the disciples were struggling. A storm had indeed caught them, and they were exhausted from trying to row out of it. So Jesus, as one does, casually walked out onto the lake just to check on them. Mark chapter 6, another fascinating story. The writer says that Jesus walked out onto the water, fully intending to pass by the boat, just to check in. And apparently he could see when he got there that they were doing okay. They didn't actually need him, so he tried to sneak on past, but he got caught. They saw him and freaked out because they thought he must be a ghost. Busted. So now he had to go over there to calm them down. And he did. And he calmed the storm as well. And again, Jesus seems to be so disappointed by this. You can hear the frustration in the description. The disciples were so amazed all over again, but it was ironic that after all they had seen, they still did not understand and trust. Their hearts were hardened, the writer says. Pretty serious insult for the Bible. Then the fourth crossing happens in Mark chapter 8. There was another great crowd and another miraculous multiplying of food, 4,000 people, fed with a few loaves of bread and a handful of fish, with plenty of leftovers to spare. And then Jesus and the disciples got back into the boat to cross the sea yet again. And as they're going, one of the disciples pointed out that they only brought one loaf of bread with them. "Oh no, we're not prepared. We're heading out into the storm again, and we don't even have enough food for the journey." What? After what they had just witnessed, they were worried about food supply? Jesus overheard the discussion, and he yelled at them this time. "What are you talking about? No bread? Don't you get it? How hard are your hearts? You have eyes. Why can't you see? You have ears, but you can't hear. Don't you remember? How are you not getting this?" Harsh. Maybe they deserved it. I'm not sure any of us would have done much better. And further, Jesus doesn't do anything to help them this time. He doesn't give them the answers. He just calls out their lack of understanding. He doesn't give them more bread. He just sends them out into the storm, ready or not. If they run into trouble this time, will Jesus help them? It's an open question, it seems. So that's the larger story. 4 times across the sea, 2 literal storms, but 4 metaphorical ones. And Jesus grows more and more frustrated with his followers and does less and less to help them. Alexander Shia. Jesus' disciples simply presume that Jesus will perform a divine act. and in every instance relieve them of their fear. They seem to completely ignore their responsibilities, which were to endure and attempt to find inner calm through faith. By the fourth and final crossing, Jesus is totally exasperated and demands to know if his disciples have yet learned anything whatsoever. Mark's message, an invaluable lesson for the Roman Messianic Jews, is that the disciples still sought a God who rescued them, who removed obstacles. They wanted to remain safe as children with a God who acted as an all-powerful, protective parent. They could not yet fathom a God who not only did not do this, but who actually pushed his followers into a dark, nighttime storms. They did not yet have the spiritual maturity from which they could derive inner equilibrium and serenity in the midst of trial. They had not yet discovered an inner place of God. That's the harsh truth of Mark's gospel. Jesus is not here to save us from the storm. Faith will not protect us from challenges, suffering, or death. Storms happen, and Jesus is not all that interested in calming them. Instead, in Mark's gospel, Jesus expects his followers to grow into maturity and resilience themselves, enough to weather the storms. Is that a helpful message for the community of Christians in Rome, caught up in a wild struggle beyond their control, facing their literal torture and death? Stop waiting for Jesus to rescue you. Wake up, grow up, show up, and learn to get through this on the strength that lives within you. That's not exactly what I want to hear in my times of struggle. It's not exactly the message I want to preach in the middle of a pandemic. What made all the difference for this gospel truth was that this church in Rome knew the people in this story. This community of followers was founded by the Apostle Peter. He had lived and died as one of them. He knew their struggles. And Peter was one of those disciples in the boat on those storms. He was one of those disciples with blind eyes and deaf ears. He saw the miracles and still doubted. He heard directly and did not understand. Peter outspokenly challenged Jesus' direction multiple times. And yet, somehow, Peter grew into this great man of faith, the leader of their church, not only understanding Jesus and sharing his teachings, but truly walking in Jesus' way, faithful even to death at the hands of the Romans. At the beginning of the story, the disciples are entirely dependent on Jesus. He recruits them, takes care of them, he explains things to them, he feeds them and heals them and leads them around. But by the end of the story, when Jesus leaves them for good, they find that they have become the teachers and healers and leaders. The power of Jesus lives inside of them, and it has been there all along. I know it's a Wizard of Oz cliche, but it's also the gospel truth. The part of the story that reveals their own strength is the part where they went through the storm on their own. Not alone. They learned that they were never alone. But they discovered that not by looking for someone out there to rescue them, but by facing down the storms that forced them to look within. I suspect most of us know people like that, those who were shaped by the storms of life and came through with more wisdom, more courage, more in touch with themselves and with the divine. Our culture worships people like that, elevates them into celebrities, makes them into lifetime movies. But the invitation of Mark's gospel is to go beyond venerating them as heroes, to follow in their footsteps by entering into our own struggles, whatever those might be. By the end of the gospel, the disciples not only worship Jesus, they do the things that he does. They wake up, grow up, and show up themselves. The journey of the gospel is of awakening to the Spirit of God, who is already and always present. And the storm is a critical, transformative part of that journey. Even our pain belongs. The Spirit of God is hovering even over these waters, and all will be well. That's not to say that all suffering is redemptive, or that we should ignore or celebrate the storms that break people. The storm, the suffering, is only part of the story. Mark is only one of 4 chapters in the gospel narrative. There is also healing, compassion, justice, joy, and love in action. There's a whole lot more going on in life than our pain. Mark's call to embrace the storm is not God's only word on suffering, but it is an essential word, a part of the journey that must not be skipped. The uncertainty of the storm is part of God's story. It has been from the beginning. The final time Jesus and the disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee, they went to a city called Caesarea Philippi. This place was famous for its grand spring. At the time, the water came gushing out of this cave. It was the primary source of the Jordan River. The fountains of the deep. In their worldview, Jesus is bringing them full circle. The storms from above revealing how far beyond their control this world really is. The springs from the depths, reminding them that even the solid ground wasn't as solid as it appeared. We're all just clinging to this rocky planet, hurtling through infinite space, only a thin skin of atmosphere protecting us from the void. Dangers abound. The chaos and emptiness surrounds us. And yet, the water still brings life. The spring comes from the chaos, and yet it gives nourishment. You know these waters. They nourish your land. You fish in them. They run inside you. Yes, this spring leads to rivers and seas of great danger, but those same rivers and seas have sustained the people of God from the beginning. You can't avoid the pain and vulnerability of life and death. The uncertainty that you fear is also the very source of life. It was in that space, before the fountain of the deep, that Jesus directly told the disciples for the first time that he fully expected to suffer. He was going to be rejected and killed. And through this, he would rise again. Then once again, he turned it back on them. If you wish to come after me, you must deny your very self. Take up your cross and follow in my footsteps. If you would save your life, you will lose it. But if you lose your life in my way, you will save it. The paradox is that the waters that bring danger also bring life. The storms that crush us also reveal the presence of God within us. The chaos of life is all around us, and so is the Spirit of God. And opening ourselves up to that Spirit of God also means opening ourselves up to the uncertainty. I'm not going out looking for storms to chase this week. I certainly don't wish them on any of you. But when they come, from without and within, may you hear the Spirit of God on the winds, from without and within, and know that all is well.